Hi everyone, welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you use this video to sleep, so before you drift off, I'd love to hear from you. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's always incredible to see how far this sleepy little community stretches across the globe. If you're enjoying the stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. So, get comfortable. Let the rain carry your thoughts and let's jump into tonight's stories. Story 1. This is the case of a man who was allegedly held captive by his stepmother for more than 20 years. A story of survival, escape, and the long road to reclaiming a life stolen in the silence. Some stories live in the darkness, buried beneath years of silence. They unfold behind closed doors, hidden in places where no one is watching, where no one is listening. They are the kinds of stories people only hear about long after the damage is done, after the truth has fought its way to the surface. For more than 2 decades, a boy lived in that silence. He was never declared missing. His face didn't appear on posters taped to storefront windows. There were no late-night pleas from family members, no candlelight vigils in his honor. To most people, he had simply faded away. But he wasn't gone. He was right there, in the same house where he had once laughed, once dreamed, once been a child full of curiosity and hope. That house, the place that should have been safe, the place that should have protected him, became his entire world, his cage. It happened quietly, seamlessly, without warning. He was 11 years old when his life was stripped down to something unrecognizable. No school. No friends. No glimpses of sunlight beyond the windows that were kept tightly shut. Days blurred into months, months into years. The outside world moved forward while he remained trapped in a relentless cycle of survival, in a place where even the smallest comforts, fresh air, warm food, human connection, were out of reach. It is hard to imagine. Hard to understand how something so devastating, so monstrous, could persist for so long without intervention. And yet, for more than 20 years, that was his reality. Then, one day, there was fire. The flames tore through the house that had held him captive for so long. And in the wreckage, in the aftermath of destruction, he was finally found. 33 years old. 54 kilograms. Eyes that had seen far too much. Rescue. Recovery. Redemption. But the story doesn't end here. Because now, for the first time, he's speaking out. For the first time, he is telling the world what happened. And the question remains, how does something like this happen? And how does it happen without anyone knowing? Before the silence, before the years of captivity, before he became someone struggling to survive in the shadows, he was just a boy. A boy with a name, a home, a life that, for a time, was ordinary. His childhood was not one marked by luxury, but it was familiar. He had routines, school days, moments of laughter woven into everyday life. If you had seen him then, running down the street, playing with neighborhood kids, or walking home from school, you would have seen nothing out of place. But families are not always what they appear. Sometimes, beneath the surface, there are fractures no one sees. Cracks that widen over time, becoming something far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. His father was there, but distant. A man who worked long hours, who was present in name but not always in practice. His mother, gone, out of his life before he was old enough to understand why. And then, there was his stepmother. The woman who, for reasons unknown, would become the force that shaped the nightmare to come. At first, she was just a figure in his home, someone he was expected to trust, someone meant to care for him. There were moments, small, fleeting moments, when it seemed like she might. But there were also signs. Quiet warnings that the warmth was an illusion, that beneath the surface lay something colder. And then, one day, his world shifted completely. He was 11 years old when the life he knew was stripped away. When the home he had known transformed into something unrecognizable. It started with something seemingly simple: he was pulled out of school. There was no discussion, no explanation beyond what he was told. He didn't need it anymore. That was the justification, the reason given. But what it really was the first step in making sure he disappeared. At first, he thought it was temporary. He believed that, soon enough, he would be back in class, back with his friends, back to the life he understood. But the days passed. Then the weeks. Then the months. And the reality set in: he was no longer part of that world. From the outside, it didn't seem like much. A child withdrawn from school, a household adjusting. But within those walls, something else was happening. The restrictions tightened. The doors closed. His freedom, piece by piece, faded into nothing. There was no sudden moment, no grand, dramatic shift that marked the descent into captivity. Instead, it happened quietly. Systematically. A slow unraveling of his autonomy, his voice, his ability to be anything other than what she allowed. By the time anyone might have questioned where he was, by the time any school official or neighbor might have wondered why he hadn't been seen, it was already too late. The world moved forward, and he remained behind. Hidden. Forgotten. Trapped. For 20 years, his world was reduced to the barest essentials of survival. The house that had once been his home became his prison, a place where every corner, every shadow, every sound carried the weight of his captivity. The conditions were unimaginable. Malnourishment became his reality, his body slowly wasting away as the days turned into years. Food was scarce, and what little he could find was often discarded, scraps from the trash, remnants of meals that were never meant for him. Water was no better. When he was desperate, when there was no other option, he drank from the toilet. Isolation was his constant companion. The walls of the house were his only view, the silence his only soundtrack. There were no conversations, no laughter, no connection to the outside world. He was alone, completely and utterly alone, with nothing but his thoughts to keep him company. But the physical torment was only part of the story. The psychological toll was just as devastating. Day after day, he was reminded of his powerlessness, his inability to escape, his dependence on the very person who had taken everything from him. His stepmother's control was absolute. She dictated every aspect of his life, from when he could eat to when he could sleep. She used fear as her weapon, ensuring that he never dared to defy her. And when he did, the consequences were swift and severe. Over time, his body began to show the effects of his captivity. His weight dropped to a mere 68 pounds, a stark reminder of the years of malnourishment and neglect. His skin was pale, his eyes sunken, his frame fragile. He was a shadow of the boy he had once been, a living testament to the horrors he had endured. And yet, somehow, he survived. Through sheer willpower, through an unyielding determination to hold on, he managed to endure the unimaginable. He found ways to adapt, to cope, to keep going even when it seemed impossible. But survival came at a cost. The years of captivity left scars, physical, emotional, psychological, that would take a lifetime to heal. And even after he was rescued, even after he was finally free, the memories of those years remained, a constant reminder of the darkness he had lived through. This is the story of a man who was held captive for more than 20 years. A story of resilience, of survival, of a life stolen and a life reclaimed. And as we continue to uncover the details of his captivity, we are reminded of the strength it takes to endure, and the courage it takes to speak out. For years, escape was not an option. It wasn't something he dared to dream about. Survival had become his only goal, making it through each day, enduring the conditions, waiting for something to change. But nothing ever did. He had spent more than 2 decades trapped in silence, in isolation, in a reality that defied logic. His body was failing, his mind worn thin by the relentless routine of suffering. And the truth was becoming undeniable: if he stayed, he would not survive. Something had to happen. Something had to break the cycle. And so, for the first time in more than 20 years, he acted. Not out of hesitation. Not out of fear. But out of sheer desperation. The fire started small. A flicker. A single flame catching hold of something dry, something vulnerable to its grip. It was a risk, a dangerous, unpredictable move, but in his mind, there was no other way. Smoke curled up, slow at first, then thick and suffocating. The walls, the ceiling, the very place that had imprisoned him for so long, now turning into something unstable, something uncontrollable. His stepmother was still inside. He heard the panic in her voice as the realization struck: the house was burning, the structure collapsing under the weight of the flames. And in that chaos, in the confusion and terror, he made his move. He pushed forward, his weakened body stumbling toward the exit, toward freedom. The heat clawed at his skin, the air thick with smoke, but he did not stop. He could not stop. This was his chance. And then, fresh air. Open space. A world far larger than the one he had known for so long. Emergency responders arrived within minutes. The fire raged behind him, swallowing the place that had defined his suffering. And as they rushed toward the burning home, toward the rescue effort, they found him, standing there, frail, disoriented. He was 33 years old, but he looked decades younger, his body worn down by the years of captivity. 54 kilograms. Malnourished. Eyes hollow, skin pale. For a moment, they didn't understand what they were seeing. A grown man, skeletal and trembling, emerging from the wreckage of a home that had held him prisoner for most of his life. He was rushed to the hospital. Medical staff moved quickly, assessing his condition, documenting his injuries, trying to piece together the story that had led to this moment. And then, the truth came spilling out. This was not just a victim of a fire. This was not just an accident. This was something far more disturbing, something that would shake everyone who heard his story. For the first time in 22 years, he was free. But freedom, he would soon realize, was just the beginning. Because now, the world would have questions. And the answers were almost too horrific to believe. When the truth finally emerged, it was met with disbelief. Shock. Outrage. It was impossible to comprehend. How could a man live in captivity for 22 years without anyone knowing? How could a child be erased, swallowed by silence, forced to endure conditions so horrific that survival itself became an act of defiance? And how could the one responsible walk free for all those years? His stepmother, the woman who had controlled every moment of his existence, was arrested immediately. The charges were staggering: kidnapping, aggravated assault, child abuse, unlawful imprisonment, and more. Each one a reflection of the years of suffering, each one carrying the weight of her actions. But when confronted, she did not break. She did not weep. She did not express remorse. Instead, she denied everything. Her defense was swift, calculated, crafted to dismantle the accusations that had been laid before her. She claimed he had not been held captive. She claimed he had stayed willingly. She claimed she had cared for him, fed him, given him everything he needed. She painted a picture of a troubled young man, someone incapable of navigating the outside world, someone who had chosen isolation over uncertainty. And in the courtroom, in front of those who had come seeking justice, she stood by those claims. But the evidence spoke louder. The medical reports detailed the malnourishment, the physical deterioration, the psychological toll. The photographs showed the stark reality: a man whose body had been stripped of strength, whose frame was fragile, whose very existence had been reduced to survival. And then, there was his voice. For the first time, he told his story. He spoke of the years trapped in that house, the meals he was denied, the hunger that drove him to search for food anywhere he could. He spoke of the silence, the isolation, the mind games that kept him powerless. He spoke of the fear, the deep, unshakable fear that if he did not obey, if he did not follow the rules she set, the consequences would be unbearable. And the world listened. The trial became a spectacle, a case that sparked national attention, an unfolding tragedy that demanded justice. People were outraged. Social media erupted with questions: how did this happen? Why didn't anyone notice? How could a person inflict this kind of suffering for so long? There were debates, theories, arguments over who had failed him: his father, the authorities, the neighbors, the school system that had let him disappear without a trace. And yet, despite the anger, despite the demand for answers, the focus remained on one undeniable truth. He was free. For more than 2 decades, his identity was something controlled by someone else. His name, his existence, his very presence in the world, it was all dictated, restricted, manipulated. Now, for the first time, he had the chance to redefine himself. Standing before the world, no longer hidden, no longer silenced, he made his first public statement. He had chosen a new name. A name that was his and his alone. A name that held no attachment to the past. A name that signified freedom. It was the first step, a declaration that the life he had lost was no longer just a story of captivity, but a story of reclamation. He spoke softly, his voice measured, deliberate. There was no anger, no resentment in his tone, only quiet strength. He thanked the people who had saved him. The emergency responders, the medical professionals, the investigators who had worked tirelessly to piece together his story. He expressed gratitude for the kindness, the support, the humanity that had surrounded him in the days following his escape. And yet, even in his relief, even in his newfound freedom, there was an undeniable truth: healing would take time. The scars, physical, emotional, psychological, were deep. The world was new to him. Bright, loud, full of possibilities, but also overwhelming, unfamiliar. He spoke about his plans. He wanted to learn. To experience the things he had been denied. To understand the world beyond the walls that had confined him for so long. He wanted to reclaim what had been lost, to rebuild himself piece by piece. There were moments of hesitation, memories that lingered, fears that surfaced. But there was also hope. Hope that his story would bring awareness. Hope that his survival would serve as proof that even in the darkest circumstances, there is a way forward. As he took his first steps into the life that was finally his, the world listened. Not just to the tragedy, not just to the suffering, but to the strength it took to emerge from it. And in that moment, his story became more than a case, more than a headline. It became a testament to resilience. To justice. To survival. And now, for the first time in 22 years, he was free to write the rest of it, on his own terms. Story 2. This is the story of a U.S. pastor Josh Sullivan rescued in shootout after abduction at gunpoint in South Africa. It was a Sunday like any other. Everything seemed ordinary. But within the walls of New Life Christian Center, time felt slower, more deliberate. The church, a humble brick structure with arched windows and weathered pews, held within it a different kind of quiet. The air carried the scent of wax from burning candles, mingling with the soft perfume of well-worn Bibles and fresh linen draped across the altar. Voices rose in gentle harmony. Men, women, and children, some dressed in their Sunday best, others in modest work clothes, gathered here every week, finding solace in the familiar rhythm of prayer and worship. The wooden benches creaked softly as people leaned forward, hands clasped, heads bowed. At the front of the congregation stood Pastor Josh Sullivan. Tall, broad-shouldered, his presence carried a quiet authority. His worn leather Bible rested gently in his hands, the faded pages telling stories of countless sermons preached, lessons shared, wisdom passed down. He was not from here. Born and raised in the United States, he had spent much of his life traveling across continents, carrying with him an unwavering faith, a belief that people, no matter how lost, could find redemption. His mission work had taken him from sprawling urban centers to the most remote villages, each place leaving its mark on him, shaping his understanding of the world and the people in it. For nearly 3 years, South Africa had been his home. His work stretched beyond the pulpit. He had helped build shelters for those in need, organized food drives, counseled troubled youth seeking a path forward. He was a man of deep conviction, known for his gentle but firm presence, a shepherd among his flock. The sermon that morning was about resilience. His voice carried through the room, not loud, not commanding, but steady. He spoke of faith in the unseen, of strength found in moments of hardship. His words settled into the space, filling every corner, drifting into the ears and hearts of those listening. For many in this congregation, life was not easy. Some had faced great loss. Others battled daily struggles, poverty, addiction, uncertainty. But here, within these walls, there was hope. There was a promise that, even in the face of darkness, light remained. Outside, just beyond view, footsteps traced the ground. Slow. Unhurried. Purposeful. A group of men lingered near the parking lot. Silent. Observing. No one inside knew they were there. No one sensed the change in the air. The worship continued. People sang. People prayed. People listened. Then. A shift. A presence at the back. The doors swung open. Everything changed. At first, it was unclear what had happened. The congregation turned, startled by the sudden movement. The sound of footsteps echoed through the room, heavy, deliberate, breaking the sacred stillness. 4 men entered. Their faces were hidden behind black masks, their eyes barely visible beneath the fabric. They moved with precision, their presence commanding attention. Each step they took seemed to weigh heavier than the last, as if the air itself had thickened around them. The room froze. Pastor Sullivan stood at the pulpit, his hands still resting on his Bible. His gaze shifted toward the intruders, his expression calm but alert. The congregation, seated in rows before him, exchanged nervous glances. Some clutched their belongings tightly, others whispered prayers under their breath. One of the masked men raised his hand, signaling the others. Without a word, they began moving through the aisles. Their movements were swift, calculated. They demanded phones, wallets, jewelry, anything of value. The congregation complied, their fear outweighing any thoughts of resistance. The men spoke in low voices, their words clipped and direct. They avoided unnecessary conversation, their focus unwavering. It was clear they had done this before. But this time was different. As the men moved through the room, one of them stopped near the pulpit. His gaze locked onto Pastor Sullivan. He tilted his head slightly, as if studying him, before speaking. Josh Sullivan. The pastor's name hung in the air, heavy with implication. The congregation stirred, their unease growing. How did these men know his name? Why had they singled him out? The man stepped closer. "You're coming with us." His voice was firm, leaving no room for negotiation. Pastor Sullivan hesitated for a moment, his eyes scanning the room. He saw the fear in his congregation's faces, the silent pleas for safety. Slowly, he nodded. "If it keeps them safe," he said, his voice steady, "I'll go." The men wasted no time. They grabbed Sullivan by the arm, pulling him away from the pulpit. The congregation watched in stunned silence as their pastor was led toward the door. Some began to cry, others whispered prayers, their voices trembling. As the men reached the exit, one of them turned back. He scanned the room, his gaze lingering for a moment before stepping outside. The doors closed behind them, leaving the congregation in a state of shock. Outside, the men moved quickly. They led Sullivan to a waiting vehicle, its engine already running. The pastor climbed into the back seat, his hands resting calmly on his lap. The men joined him, their movements sharp and efficient. The vehicle sped away, disappearing into the distance. Inside the church, the congregation remained seated, their minds racing. Questions swirled. Who were these men? Why had they taken Sullivan? And most importantly, would he be safe? The news spread quickly. Inside the New Life Christian Center, shock gave way to whispered conversations. The congregation still sat in silence, their minds struggling to piece together what had just unfolded before them. Some remained frozen in their seats, staring at the doors where their pastor had been led away. Others gripped their phones, hands trembling, attempting to call loved ones. But outside, the real search had begun. It was late afternoon when the first clue emerged. A local farmer, driving along a dusty back road miles from the church, noticed something unusual: a vehicle, abandoned, its driver's side door left slightly ajar. He slowed his truck, pulling over carefully. The car was a silver Toyota Hilux, its tires coated in the dry earth of the South African countryside. Something about it felt off. There were no signs of life, no movement around the area, only the soft rustling of trees in the wind. The farmer hesitated for a moment, then reached for his phone. His fingers shook slightly as he dialed the local authorities. Within minutes, police arrived. They approached the vehicle cautiously, their flashlights sweeping over the ground. Josh Sullivan's wallet was discovered inside, resting near the center console. His phone, however, was missing. The officers exchanged knowing glances. The pattern was clear: this was not a random carjacking. Sullivan had been deliberately taken, his vehicle abandoned in a way that suggested careful planning. The leads were sparse. Forensics teams arrived shortly after, dusting the vehicle for fingerprints, inspecting the tires for fresh tracks. Time was crucial. If Sullivan had been taken by a criminal syndicate, every hour that passed made his rescue more complicated. Then came the breakthrough. A tip from an anonymous caller. A voice, male, calm but hurried, claiming that Sullivan was being held at a location not far from the outskirts of town. A house, the voice had said. Near the abandoned railway line. Authorities acted swiftly. Unmarked police vehicles moved through the outskirts of Motherwell, tracing a path toward the suspected location. The roads grew narrower, the buildings more scattered. It was the kind of place where people minded their own business, where strangers were noticed but rarely questioned. The safe house came into view. The safe house stood in quiet isolation. The structure itself was plain, unremarkable, just another worn-down home in a forgotten part of the outskirts. But behind those shuttered windows, behind the peeling paint and rusted hinges, something was happening. Something urgent. Outside, officers moved into position. The sun had begun its descent, casting long shadows across the ground. The air was dry, tense, filled with the muted hum of insects in the grass. Officers spoke in hushed tones, their radios transmitting quiet instructions. Every movement was measured, no rushing, no panic, only calculated precision. They had confirmed Sullivan was inside. They had seen the silhouette. There was no way of knowing his condition, but he was there. That much was certain. They waited. Then, the order came. A team approached the front entrance, moving carefully, scanning each detail, the doorframe, the lock, the ground beneath them. Another team positioned themselves at the rear exit, sealing off any attempt at escape. The knock was firm. A pause. Silence. Then, a voice from inside. Low. Cautious. "Who is it?" The officers responded with authority, their words clear, unwavering. "Nothing." A breath. A pause. Then, movement. A sound behind the door. The officers braced. Then, the door swung open. Not slowly. Not with hesitation. It was ripped open, violently, as if the force of the moment demanded urgency. Inside, shadows shifted. Figures. Then, the first shot. A burst of sound. Sudden. Sharp. Then another. The officers responded immediately, returning fire, their actions controlled, precise. The exchange was brief, mere seconds, but each second carried weight. When the dust settled, 3 suspects lay motionless. Their weapons scattered on the floor, their bodies still. The air, once filled with tension, had become eerily quiet. Then, the search. Inside, officers moved swiftly, scanning the room, pushing forward. And then, they found him. Josh Sullivan. Seated near the back wall. He was alive. Not bound. Not harmed. Just waiting. When the officers reached him, he looked up, his expression unreadable, his breathing steady. "It's over," one of them said. Sullivan nodded. He rose to his feet. And, without a word, he stepped forward. The dust had settled. The safe house, once filled with tension and uncertainty, now stood silent. Officers moved through the rooms, their footsteps measured, their voices low as they secured the area. Outside, the last traces of sunlight cast a soft glow over the dry earth, stretching shadows across the ground. Josh Sullivan stood near the doorway, his posture steady, his hands relaxed at his sides. He was unharmed. No bruises. No wounds. No signs of struggle. It was as if, despite everything, he had remained untouched by the chaos surrounding him. It was a detail that wouldn't go unnoticed. The officers exchanged brief glances. The situation had been dangerous. A shootout. 3 suspects dead. And yet, Sullivan had emerged as if he'd simply walked through a storm, his spirit intact. He was led to a waiting vehicle. The drive back to town was quiet. Sullivan sat still, watching the passing scenery, the blurred outlines of houses and storefronts shifting in the evening light. He didn't speak much. There was nothing to say, not yet. When they arrived at the station, the medical team was already waiting. They ran their assessments carefully. Checked for signs of shock, exhaustion, dehydration. But everything was normal. Sullivan's heart rate was steady, his blood pressure even. His vitals showed no concerning signs. Physically, he was in excellent condition. Emotionally? That was harder to measure. The news had already reached the United States. His family, his wife, his children, had been waiting anxiously for any update. When word finally arrived that Sullivan had been rescued, relief washed over them. But with relief came a quiet plea. Privacy. No interviews. No press statements. No public speculation. They just wanted him home. They wanted to hear his voice, to know that he was really okay. The fear of the unknown had been unbearable, the long hours filled with questions they couldn't answer. For now, they asked for space. Back in Motherwell, the congregation gathered. The church, the place where it had all started, was filled with people, faces lined with concern, eyes still carrying remnants of the fear they had felt when their pastor was taken. The prayers came in waves. Some whispered softly, heads bowed in quiet reflection. Others spoke openly, their words filled with gratitude. Their pastor was alive. After everything, he had returned. A service was held. Not to relive the ordeal, but to acknowledge that, despite everything, hope had prevailed. They sang. They embraced. They found comfort in the knowledge that the night had not ended in loss. The events of the last 24 hours had been unlike anything Sullivan had ever experienced. It was difficult to process. The masked men, the stolen moments, the strange stillness he had felt in that room as he waited. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was something deeper, something unspoken, an understanding that, in the chaos of it all, he had not been alone. There was a moment when he looked around at the faces gathered at the church. The ones who had prayed for him. The ones who had waited. And for the first time since it had happened, he let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. A terrifying ordeal, but one that had ended with hope. Story 3. This is the tragic story of Megan Boss and the case of Jose Luis Mendoza Gonzalez, Illinois man charged with concealing missing woman's death after keeping her body in storage container. You know, time has a way of softening memories. It blurs the edges, turns sharp moments into hazy recollections, and leaves behind only fragments. A conversation. A glimpse. A laugh that echoed on a quiet street. And then, silence. Absence. A space that someone once filled, now vacant. This is how disappearances slip into the fabric of everyday life. Slowly. Unnoticed at first. In Waukegan, Illinois, a town that moves with its own quiet rhythm, life continued just as it always had. A place of small routines. Familiar faces. The comforting predictability of normal days blending into one another. It was within this rhythm that Megan Boss existed. A young woman in her mid-20s, Megan had a life like many others, one with friendships, aspirations, fleeting moments of joy and uncertainty. She wasn't known to the world, not the way some people are. She wasn't famous. She wasn't the subject of headlines. She wasn't someone whose face appeared on breaking news alerts. Until one day, she was. It began, as many cases do, with quiet concern. A missed call. A message left unanswered. The kind of thing that happens all the time, easily dismissed. People get busy. Phones die. Plans change. But days stretched longer, and the unanswered messages became more unsettling. No one heard from Megan. No social media updates. No signs of life. At first, the absence was met with uncertainty, questions without urgency. Maybe she had taken a trip. Maybe she was staying with someone and simply hadn't checked in. But assumptions dissolve over time. And when the days became weeks, uncertainty turned into something else. Something heavier. Police reports were filed. Calls were made. Concern transformed into searching. Yet there was no movement, no trace of Megan, no lead to follow. It was as if she had simply vanished. This is the moment in many cases when the narrative shifts, when speculation takes hold, theories emerge, and the possibility of foul play begins to darken the story. But Megan's case was different. There were no public warnings. No breaking news. No widespread search teams combing through miles of land. It was quiet. And in that silence, somewhere in the vast unknown of an unanswered disappearance, the truth waited. For months, it remained hidden. Unseen. Locked away. And when it was finally found, inside a storage container, the reality of Megan's absence became undeniable. Tonight, we piece together that reality. From the beginning, to the moment the truth was uncovered. Every detail. Every moment. Because behind every disappearance, every unanswered question, there is something waiting to be discovered. The days before someone disappears rarely feel significant in the moment. They are ordinary, unremarkable. A routine trip to the store. A text sent without a second thought. A conversation with a friend, casual and familiar. And yet, when absence settles in, those moments take on weight they never had before. For Megan Boss, the final days before she vanished did not hold warning signs, at least, none that anyone saw at the time. She was last seen in early September 2023. The details of that sighting were vague. A brief encounter. A passing moment. She wasn't reported as distressed or afraid. She wasn't running from anything, at least, not visibly. She was just Megan. Living. But after that moment, nothing. Her phone, usually active, fell silent. Calls went unanswered, messages unread. No updates. No signs of movement. No proof that she was still out there. Her absence stretched into days, then weeks. The people closest to her grew uneasy, suspicion creeping in where concern once sat. Because people don't just disappear. Not without reason. As her loved ones tried to piece together her last known movements, another name surfaced, José Luis Mendoza González. He was the last person known to have been with Megan. A connection. A possible thread to follow. When police began asking questions, Mendoza González's responses were unclear, uneven. He claimed Megan had died, but there had been no report, no official record, no acknowledgement of her death. Just words. And something about those words didn't feel right. Still, without evidence, uncertainty lingered. The police treated Megan's case as a missing person investigation. They looked for leads, traced any possible direction she might have gone. But with no activity on her accounts, no new sightings, and no clear explanations, the search led nowhere. It remained open. But it remained unanswered. The name José Luis Mendoza González had surfaced early in the investigation. A connection. A possible key to understanding what happened to Megan Boss. At first, his involvement was little more than speculation. He wasn't a suspect. He wasn't accused of any crime. He was simply someone Megan had known. Someone she had been with near the time she disappeared. And yet, when questioned, his answers wove a story that didn't quite hold together. When police asked about Megan, Mendoza González didn't deny knowing her. He admitted they had spent time together. He admitted she had been in his home. He admitted, without hesitation, that she was no longer alive. But there was no urgency in his words. No panic. No grief. Just a statement, given plainly, Megan had died. The officers, stunned by his admission, pressed for details. What had happened? Where was she? And then came the words that would shift the case entirely. Her body is in a storage container, he said. A storage container. The weight of those words settled into the air, thick and suffocating. Because for months, Megan had been missing. For months, there had been no answers. No trace. No proof. And now, in just a few words, Mendoza Gonzalez had provided the truth no one had been prepared to hear. But his explanation did not bring closure. It raised more questions. According to him, Megan had died suddenly. No violence. No struggle. No foul play. He claimed she had overdosed. And in his panic, he had placed her body in the container, hiding it, concealing what had happened, rather than reporting her death. It was a story that could have explained her disappearance. But it was a story that left too many unanswered gaps. Because hiding a body is not a decision made lightly. It is not instinct. It is deliberate. And for weeks, while Megan's loved ones searched, while questions mounted, while time pressed forward without resolution, her body sat, sealed away, unseen. When authorities opened the container, the truth came spilling out. No signs of struggle. No immediate evidence of trauma. No indication of a violent act. But there was no comfort in those findings. Because Megan had been gone for too long. And in the silence of that storage unit, in the absence of any attempt to seek help, the truth of what happened remained unclear. Toxicology reports were ordered. Tests that might confirm, or refute, Mendoza Gonzalez's claims. But results take time. And until that time came, all anyone had was uncertainty. And the terrible knowledge that Megan had spent her final moments in a place no one had known to look. The discovery of Megan Boss's body in a storage container answered one question. But in its place, it left 100 more. For months, no one had known where she was. No one had understood what had happened. And then, in a single admission, José Luis Mendoza Gonzalez had revealed a truth both horrifying and perplexing. He had known all along. But even with the discovery, there was no clarity, only more uncertainty. Mendoza Gonzalez claimed that Megan had overdosed. No struggle. No harm inflicted upon her. No violence. The explanation was simple, too simple. Because if Megan had truly overdosed, why hadn't he called for help? Why had he chosen to hide her body rather than alert authorities? Why had he left her there, sealed away in a storage unit, for months, as though she was a secret rather than a person? His answers never quite fit. He spoke of panic, of fear, of not knowing what to do. But his actions didn't reflect desperation. They reflected calculation. Because hiding a body isn't a momentary lapse in judgment. It's not a single wrong decision made in the heat of distress. It's deliberate. Intentional. And the longer he concealed the truth, the heavier the weight of his silence became. When police pressed further, his responses remained unchanged, repetitive, unwavering in their simplicity. Megan overdosed. That was all he offered. No additional details. No explanations for his choices. No remorse. But law doesn't rely on statements alone. It requires evidence. A toxicology report was ordered, seeking confirmation, proof that Mendoza Gonzalez's story aligned with reality. But results take time. And while the investigation waited for the science to speak, legal proceedings moved forward. The day José Luis Mendoza Gonzalez first stepped into the courtroom, the weight of his silence followed him. He did not arrive as a man accused of murder. The charges against him did not label him as a killer. But they did mark him as something else, someone who had concealed a truth. Someone who had let a body sit, untouched, unseen, sealed away in a storage container for months. There was no dramatic outburst. No visible emotion. No sign of regret or distress. He sat there, listening as the charges were laid out before him. Concealment of a death. Abuse of a corpse. Obstruction of justice. These were not accusations of impulse. They were accusations of intent. As the courtroom filled with quiet murmurs, the details of the case unfolded before those who had come to witness it. The judge spoke of the investigation. The prosecution outlined their argument, detailing Mendoza Gonzalez's admission, his failure to report Megan's death, his decision to hide her rather than seek help. But no one spoke of motive, not yet. For now, the legal system moved with caution, waiting for the evidence that would dictate the next steps. Outside the courthouse, the case had begun to take shape in the eyes of the public. What had once been a quiet, unnoticed disappearance was now a story spreading through Waukegan, a story that made people uneasy, that left them questioning how something like this could have happened in their town. Some believed Mendoza Gonzalez's account, that Megan had overdosed, that he had simply panicked, that his actions were criminal but not violent. Others weren't convinced. They saw too many unanswered questions, too many gaps, too many choices that didn't align with fear but rather with calculated avoidance. The uncertainty echoed beyond the courtroom, beyond legal proceedings, beyond speculation. Because at the center of all of it, there was Megan. A life that had been quietly erased, forgotten within the walls of a storage unit. Toxicology results remained pending, holding the key to a truth that had not yet been decided. Would they confirm Mendoza Gonzalez's version of events? Would they suggest something different, something more sinister? And if they did, would the charges against him change? For now, the world waited, holding its breath in the silence left behind. The story of Megan Boss is not one that ends with clarity. It does not close with a resolution that brings comfort. It lingers, unfinished, unresolved, leaving behind questions that may never be answered. For those who knew her, the grief is more than the loss itself, it is the absence of understanding. The inability to trace back through time and pinpoint the moment everything changed. The agony of never knowing whether something could have been done differently. Whether someone could have intervened. Whether Megan, in her final moments, was afraid. For months, she was unseen. Forgotten within the locked walls of a storage unit, sealed away from the world that should have known her story. And for months, the truth remained in the possession of one person, a person who did not speak, did not confess, did not make any attempt to bring Megan back to the people who had been searching for her. And now, even with her body found, even with statements made, even with legal proceedings underway, the answers are still incomplete. Did she truly overdose? Was there something more to her death, something that toxicology results may never reveal? Was her absence simply the result of panic, of fear, of one wrong decision leading to another? Or was it something deeper, something that remains just out of reach? For Megan's family, justice is a complex word. It does not erase what has already happened. It does not undo loss. It does not fill the void left in the spaces she once occupied. But it is necessary. What happens next is uncertain. The investigation continues. The court proceedings will unfold. Evidence will be analyzed. Decisions will be made. But the world outside of those legal proceedings will continue as it always does. People will move forward, carrying with them the weight of the unknown. Carrying with them the awareness that someone real, someone loved, was locked away, forgotten, hidden in a place where no one should have had to look. This is Megan's story. A story that does not have a perfect ending. A story that does not fade quietly into history. A story that remains unfinished. Story 4. This is the case of a Massachusetts man accused of killing wife and staging her death to look like suicide in chilling cover-up. Lynn, Massachusetts, a town where life moves at its own pace. The Atlantic breeze drifts through quiet streets lined with old homes, each carrying the weight of decades past, each built to shelter the stories of the people within them. The glow of porch lights flickers on as evening falls, illuminating the well-worn sidewalks where families take their evening walks, where neighbors pause for friendly exchanges, where everything, every routine, feels safe. A place like this, where familiarity is its own comfort, where the ebb and flow of daily life is predictable, doesn't invite suspicion. People move through their days with certainty. The grocery store clerks recognize the regulars. Teachers greet students who've sat in the same classrooms their siblings once did. Police officers drive through neighborhoods they've patrolled for years. They know the roads, the faces, the unspoken rhythm of the town. If something were to happen, something unsettling, it wouldn't take long for the ripple to reach everyone. For most of Lynn, January had arrived without incident. The winter air was sharp, but not bitter. The streets, dotted with patches of ice, remained steady underfoot. Businesses prepared for the slow, quiet stretch between holiday rushes. Residents settled into the winter months, anticipating only the usual, the cold, the passing storms, the way January always lingered just a little longer than expected. But for one home, the new year would bring something else. Something no one was expecting. The call came late at night. The kind that isn't uncommon, yet always carries weight. Officers arrived. What they found. Carla Lorenzo da Silva was gone. There were no signs of struggle. No indication that anything had been out of place. For the officers who stood in that room, the answer seemed clear. The circumstances, the positioning, the immediate scene, everything pointed to a single explanation. A conclusion that was swift, simple, unquestioned. For a time, that was enough. But then, one detail. Then another. And suddenly, what had seemed clear was no longer so certain. The life of Carla Lorenzo da Silva had ended that night. But the question remained. Had it ended the way they thought it had? Time would tell. And time, as it always does, would unravel what was once hidden. Before that night, before the phone call, before the questions began to surface, there was Carla. Her name carried across small gatherings, through family dinner tables, through casual conversations at the local cafe where regular customers knew her face. She wasn't famous in Lynn, not in the way that commanded attention or demanded recognition, but she was known. Recognized. Remembered. She had a warmth to her, something unmistakable, something people noticed without quite knowing why. It was in the way she spoke, always measured but never distant, as if she understood the weight of words, the way they could linger. It was in the way she moved, thoughtful, aware, but never hesitant. Those closest to her described her as gentle but firm, kind but unwavering. She had a way of holding her ground without raising her voice, a way of making people feel heard without asking them to prove themselves. In her family, she was a presence that mattered, not just in moments of celebration but in the quiet ones, the ones where it counted. And then there was Tiago Oliveira. Tiago was different. Not unkind, not aggressive, but different. To those who spoke of him, the words were careful. Measured. Never outright negative, never openly suspicious, but cautious. There were pieces of him people struggled to place, moments of uncertainty in how they described him. A lingering thought, a fleeting doubt, a hesitation in memory. Tiago and Carla were a couple who, on the surface, seemed steady. Their lives were intertwined in the way that marriages are, the shared routines, the familiar exchanges, the expected patterns of a life built together. But beneath that, beneath what was visible to most, were moments that only a few had seen. Moments where Carla's warmth seemed subdued, where her usual confidence seemed quiet. Where she moved through conversations with a different kind of care. Tiago, by contrast, had a presence that carried weight, but not in the way Carla's did. His voice had a certainty that, at times, could feel like control. His decisions were often final before they were discussed. His silences had meaning, though few ever claimed to understand them. Their home, the one now marked by investigators, had once been just that, a home. A place where they lived as husband and wife, where the ordinary moments of life unfolded. But for those who had been close enough to notice, those who had seen just enough to wonder, the home had also been something else. A place where warmth had started to fade. A place where certainty had turned into quiet restraint. A place where Carla, once unshaken, had begun to move more carefully. And then, one night, that movement stopped. And the questions began. The last days of January had settled in like any other. Cold, quiet, unremarkable in the way winter days often are in Lynn, Massachusetts. The town moved through its routine, the morning shuffle of commuters, the dull glow of streetlights stretching into early evenings, the way life continued without pause. For Carla Lorenzo da Silva, those days felt different. Those closest to her would later remember small changes, nothing dramatic, nothing that would have sounded alarms. Just shifts. The kind you only truly recognize in hindsight. The way she hesitated before answering a simple question. The way she lingered a little longer in places she once moved through easily. The way she seemed lighter in rare moments, as though she had made a decision no one else knew about yet. There were conversations, brief but telling. Mentions of looking forward to something ahead. Little remarks about change, about steps she wanted to take, though never quite specifying what they were. For those who spoke to her, nothing about Carla seemed like someone who was preparing to say goodbye. If anything, she had started to look forward, to something beyond the life she had been living. January 29, 2025. The house on the quiet street stood unchanged. No sign that the hours ahead would unravel something no one saw coming. According to Tiago Oliveira, the evening had been uneventful. The usual movements of the household, nothing out of the ordinary. He said Carla had been home. Said she had been quiet, but not in a way that raised concern. Said nothing about the night felt different until it did. The emergency call came just before midnight. Tiago's voice was composed, urgent but measured. He told the dispatcher that he had found Carla unresponsive. Said he had tried to wake her but couldn't. His words were careful, his tone calm, too calm. First responders arrived quickly. What they saw, at first glance, made sense. Carla was found in the bedroom, her body positioned in a way that suggested tragedy, but not foul play. A single conclusion stood before them, the kind that comes easily when the scene itself tells a story. A woman, alone, no apparent wounds, no sign of intrusion. Everything pointed to the one explanation that no one ever wants to believe but is, more often than not, the truth. Suicide. It was simple. It was tragic. It was something they had seen before. But even in the quiet of that room, in the stillness that surrounded Carla, there were details. Details that, at first, were too small to question but would, in time, demand attention. The placement of objects. The arrangement of the room. The marks, faint, nearly imperceptible, but not where they should have been. The timeline, too, carried discrepancies. Statements that didn't quite fit. Moments that should have overlapped but didn't. And then there was Tiago himself. His grief seemed rehearsed. His words carried precision, not pain. His movements were exact, not shaken. He answered questions the way someone does when they have prepared for them before they were asked. And yet, for now, the conclusion remained. A tragic loss. A life ended too soon. A case seemingly closed before it had even begun. In the days following Carla Lorenzo da Silva's death, the case remained quiet. The initial reports had been filed, the scene had been processed, and the conclusion, tragic, but seemingly straightforward, had been accepted. But something lingered. For the officers who had walked through that house, for the investigators who had examined the details, there was an unease that refused to settle. It wasn't immediate. It wasn't loud. But it was there. It started with the smallest of things, the kind of details that, on their own, might have been dismissed. The way certain objects in the room seemed too deliberately placed. The way the timeline, when reconstructed, carried gaps that shouldn't have existed. The way Tiago Oliveira spoke about that night, not with the rawness of grief, but with the precision of someone who had rehearsed his words before speaking them. The first real shift came when forensic analysts reviewed the scene again. At first glance, Carla's death had appeared to be a suicide. The positioning, the lack of immediate signs of struggle, the absence of forced entry, all of it had pointed to one conclusion. But then there were the bruises. Faint, nearly imperceptible at first. Not the kind that would have been noticed in the initial assessment, but the kind that, under closer examination, told a different story. Bruises in places that didn't align with the supposed cause of death. Marks that suggested restraint rather than self-inflicted harm. Subtle, but undeniable. And then there was the forensic timeline. The estimated time of death, when compared to Tiago's statements, didn't match. The hours he claimed to have last seen Carla awake didn't align with the medical findings. The gaps in his account, small, but present, began to widen. The investigators returned to the house. This time, they weren't just looking at the scene. They were looking at the details within it, the overlooked elements, the inconsistencies that had seemed insignificant before but now demanded attention. The arrangement of objects in the room was too precise. The placement of certain items suggested an attempt to create a narrative rather than reflect reality. The way Carla had been found, the way the scene had been staged, it was too clean. Too controlled. And then there was Tiago himself. His behavior, once seen as composed, now felt calculated. His responses, once considered measured, now seemed rehearsed. His insistence that Carla had been struggling emotionally, that her death had been inevitable, now felt like an attempt to steer the investigation rather than provide answers. The arrest came swiftly. Tiago Oliveira was charged with murder, accused of staging the scene to make Carla's death appear as a suicide. The evidence, once fragmented, had come together to form a case that was undeniable. He pleaded not guilty. The courtroom, when he was arraigned, was filled with quiet tension. The charges were read aloud: murder, tampering with evidence, misleading a police investigation. Each word carried weight, each accusation built upon the findings that had unraveled the illusion he had tried to create. Outside the courtroom, the community reacted. For those who had known Carla, the news was devastating. The idea that her death had not been what it seemed, that she had been taken rather than lost, was a truth too heavy to bear. For others, it was a reckoning, a reminder that tragedy can be hidden in plain sight, that the signs of danger are often overlooked until it's too late. The media coverage was relentless. Headlines carried the story across the state, across the country. The case became more than just an investigation, it became a conversation. About justice. About domestic violence. About the ways in which the truth is sometimes buried beneath carefully constructed lies. The courtroom carried a silence that wasn't empty, it was weighted, deliberate, the kind that settles over a room when the stakes are undeniable. Every seat was filled, every gaze fixed on the man sitting at the defendant's table. Tiago Oliveira. He sat with a posture that was neither tense nor relaxed. His expression was unreadable, his movements controlled. He had entered a plea of not guilty, a declaration that, at least for now, meant the case would move forward into trial proceedings. The charges against him were severe: murder, tampering with evidence, staging a crime scene. Each accusation carried its own gravity, each one a piece of the larger puzzle that prosecutors were determined to solve. The judge read the charges aloud, the words echoing through the courtroom with deliberate precision. There was no room for ambiguity here. The law demanded clarity, and clarity was what it would provide. The prosecution wasted no time in laying out their case. They spoke of the inconsistencies in Tiago's statements, the forensic evidence that contradicted his version of events, the timeline that refused to align with his account. They presented the findings that had led investigators to question the initial assumption of suicide, the bruising, the misplaced objects, the subtle but telling signs that the scene had been altered. Tiago's defense team, in contrast, focused on doubt. They argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that the prosecution was building a case on speculation rather than certainty. They pointed to the lack of direct witnesses, the absence of a clear motive, the possibility that Carla's death had indeed been what it first appeared to be. But the weight of the evidence was undeniable. The prosecution had built a case that was methodical, deliberate, and deeply rooted in forensic analysis. The trial, when it came, would be a battle of narratives, one side seeking justice, the other seeking to dismantle the accusations piece by piece. Beyond the courtroom, the case had sparked conversations far beyond Lynn, Massachusetts. Domestic violence awareness groups had taken notice, using Carla's story as a painful but necessary reminder of the dangers that often remain hidden behind closed doors. Her name became part of a larger discussion, one that asked difficult questions about the warning signs that go unnoticed, about the systems in place to protect victims, about the ways in which justice is pursued in cases like hers. For those who had known Carla, the legal proceedings were more than just a trial. They were a reckoning. A demand for answers. A pursuit of truth in a case where the truth had been deliberately obscured. The trial had ended, but the echoes of its proceedings lingered far beyond the courtroom walls. The verdict, guilty, had been delivered with the weight of undeniable evidence, with the voices of those who had fought to uncover the truth standing firm in their pursuit of justice. But justice, as it often is, was complicated. It was not just about the conviction. It was about the story that had unfolded, the life that had been lost, the questions that remained even after the final judgment. For Carla's family, the verdict was both a resolution and a wound that would never fully heal. They had fought for answers, for accountability, for the truth to be recognized in a way that could not be ignored. But no ruling, no sentence, could undo what had been done. No legal proceeding could bring her back. And that was the reality they had to carry forward. The town of Lynn, Massachusetts, had changed in ways that were difficult to articulate. The quiet streets, the familiar routines, the sense of normalcy that had once defined the community, all of it had been touched by the events surrounding Carla's death. Conversations had shifted. Awareness had deepened. The understanding that tragedy could exist behind closed doors, that danger could be hidden in the most ordinary of places, had settled into the minds of those who had followed the case. For some, it was a wake-up call. A reminder that the signs of control, of manipulation, of quiet suffering, were often overlooked until it was too late. For others, it was a painful confirmation of what they had already known, that justice, even when served, could never fully erase the loss. Beyond Lynn, the case had sparked broader discussions. Domestic violence awareness organizations had taken notice, using Carla's story as a catalyst for change. Her name became part of a larger movement, one that sought to educate, to protect, to ensure that others would not suffer in silence. There were initiatives launched in her honor. Programs designed to provide resources for those in vulnerable situations. Campaigns that urged communities to recognize the warning signs, to intervene before tragedy could unfold. Carla's story had become more than just a case, it had become a call to action. And then there was Tiago Oliveira. His sentencing had been delivered with the full force of the law. The evidence had been undeniable, the deception meticulously unraveled. He would serve his time, but the weight of his actions would extend far beyond the confines of a prison cell. His name, once spoken in passing, was now tied to a crime that had shaken a community, that had forced people to confront the reality of hidden violence. For those who had once known him, the realization was unsettling. The man they had seen in everyday moments, the one who had walked through the same streets, who had shared conversations that seemed ordinary, had been capable of something unthinkable. And that truth was difficult to reconcile. In the end, Carla's story was not just about the crime. It was about the life she had lived, the impact she had made, the lessons that had emerged from the tragedy of her loss. It was about the voices that had refused to let her be forgotten, the people who had fought to ensure that her story would not fade into silence. And as time moved forward, as the world continued its relentless pace, her name remained. Not just in legal records, not just in headlines, but in the hearts of those who had loved her, in the efforts of those who had vowed to make a difference in her memory. Because justice, in its truest form, is not just about punishment. It is about remembrance. It is about change. It is about ensuring that the truth is never buried beneath the weight of silence. Story 5. This is the case of a 6-year-old girl who vanished from her yard after stepping outside to play. A story of loss, unanswered questions, and the search for justice in the wake of tragedy. A bright Sunday afternoon. A child, full of life, playing in her yard. The kind of day that felt simple, safe, the kind of day families remember without a second thought. The sun was high, casting golden warmth over the neighborhood. Birds called out lazily from the trees. Neighbors tending to their gardens. Cars rolling down the quiet street at a leisurely pace. And in that moment, she was there, 6-year-old Gracelyn Vick, laughing, running, completely unaware that these small, ordinary actions would be the last ones seen by anyone. A mother's watchful eye scanned the yard. Just a routine glance, the kind parents do without thinking. She stepped away for a moment. Just a moment. When she looked back, Gracelyn was gone. No sounds of distress. No sign of struggle. No open gate. No hurried footsteps fading into the distance. Gone. Hours stretched on. Calls were made. The search began. Her name echoed through the streets. Friends, neighbors, everyone searching. The sun sank lower, but no trace of her emerged. Then, just as hope hung by a thread, Gracelyn was found. Before that fateful afternoon, before her name became the centerpiece of a tragedy, Gracelyn was simply a child. A bright-eyed girl who loved to chase butterflies in the backyard, who insisted on wearing mismatched socks, who giggled at her own jokes even when no one else understood them. There's something about childhood that makes time feel infinite. The days stretched long, filled with adventure and boundless curiosity. Gracelyn was no exception. She lived as children do, without hesitation, without fear, always ready to explore, always eager to discover something new. She had a habit of humming to herself, a tune only she seemed to know. At times, it was soft and absent-minded, the kind of melody a child carries without realizing. Other times, it was loud and full of energy, when she ran through the house, when she climbed onto the couch and jumped like it was her own tiny stage. She adored stories. Fairy tales, bedtime stories, even the everyday ones, the kind her mother told about growing up, the kind her father shared about silly things that had happened at work. If there was a story to be told, she was the first to listen, eyes wide, completely immersed. "Tell me one more," she would say, tugging at her mother's sleeve just before bedtime, even when her eyelids were already heavy. just one more. And if she got that extra story, she'd fall asleep midway through, curled up with her stuffed rabbit, Ollie, the soft rise and fall of her breath marking the end of the day. Ollie wasn't just a toy to her. He was a constant companion. He had been with her since she was barely old enough to walk. Whenever she felt nervous, his small, plush body was the first thing she reached for. When she was excited, she squeezed him tightly, bouncing on her heels. And if she ever had a secret, Ollie was the one to hear it first. To outsiders, she might have seemed like any other child, playful, carefree. But to those who knew her, Gracelyn was special. She had a kind of light that made even the simplest moments feel warm. Emily Vick was a mother who understood loss. It wasn't something she spoke about often, but it lived in her, the kind of grief that never truly fades, only settles into the background of daily life. Before Gracelyn, before she built a home of her own, Emily had lost someone close to her, a sibling. A sudden tragedy, a wound that time could only soften but never fully heal. Perhaps that was why she loved so fiercely. Why she was protective in ways that sometimes seemed overly cautious. When she became a mother, she promised herself one thing: Gracelyn would always know she was loved. She would never feel alone. She would never question whether she was enough. "She was everything to me," Emily said later, voice barely above a whisper. Everything. Mark Vick was different, quieter. A man of few words, but when he spoke, his voice carried weight. He worked long hours, but his favorite part of the day was always the moment he stepped through the door and heard Gracelyn's tiny footsteps racing toward him. "She didn't just say hi," he recalled, shaking his head with a soft chuckle. "She tackled me. Every single night, no exceptions." They weren't a perfect family. The bills piled up. Stress ran high. There were nights when Emily sat at the kitchen table long after everyone else had gone to bed, trying to balance expenses, worrying about the future. But none of that mattered in the moments that counted. In the moments when Gracelyn climbed into their bed in the morning, stealing their pillows. In the moments when she dragged them outside to see a butterfly, convinced it was the prettiest thing in the world. Love was never in short supply in the Vick household. And that was what made the loss so unbearable. If anyone had asked the Vicks how life was going in the days leading up to April 13th, they would have said, normal. There was nothing unusual. No warning signs. No eerie premonitions that hinted at what was coming. Saturday night, Gracelyn had fallen asleep on the couch, her arms wrapped around Ollie. She had spent the day playing, laughing, running in circles until exhaustion finally caught up with her. She never made it to her bed, Emily later said. She was out like a light. Sunday morning, she was up before the sun had fully warmed the earth. Shoes on, ready to go outside, eager to play before breakfast. 5 minutes, Mama, she had asked, pulling on her shoes before her mother could even answer. It was normal. Routine. Emily glanced at the clock, too early for breakfast, but there was no harm in a few moments of play. Just a little while, she told her daughter, then you come in and eat. Gracelyn nodded eagerly, her little feet bouncing with excitement. She stepped outside. The world was still quiet. The neighborhood, just starting to wake. A few birds chirping from the trees. The occasional hum of a car passing down the street. She ran toward the grass, her tiny hands brushing against the dew-coated blades. Emily watched from the window. Then, for just a moment, she stepped away. They say time moves differently in moments of loss. That second stretch. That reality bends. Emily was gone for less than a minute. Not even long enough to consider it strange. She reached for something, perhaps a dish, perhaps a cloth, her mind would later struggle to remember. and when she stepped back to the window, Gracelyn wasn't there. No movement. No small figure dancing through the yard. No laughter echoing through the morning air. At first, Emily thought nothing of it. Maybe she had wandered out of sight, toward the side of the house, or behind the bushes. Gracelyn? The call was soft, casual. No answer. Gracelyn? A little louder now. Still silence. The seconds stacked on top of one another, forming something heavier than they should have. Emily stepped outside, her pace quickening. She checked behind the fence. The bushes. The small corner near the porch where Gracelyn sometimes played pretend. Nothing. Her heartbeat picked up. Within minutes, Emily was calling her husband. Then the neighbors. Then the authorities. The response was swift. The community mobilized, searching every street, every yard, every open space within walking distance. Voices called out her name, some soft, some desperate. Gracelyn. Nothing. Authorities arrived, mapping out a search radius. They checked nearby homes, questioned anyone who might have seen something. Was she alone? Did anyone see a car? Any unusual activity? No answers. By noon, the panic had set in. The kind of panic that swallows reason. That grips the chest and refuses to let go. It wasn't just Emily anymore. It was the entire town. Small clusters of people combed through streets, looking, hoping, dreading. Every minute felt longer than the last. As the hours stretched, the search became frantic. Voices were louder. Footsteps heavier. Shadows grew longer as the sun inched toward the horizon. Emily kept calling her daughter's name, over and over, until the syllables blurred together. Her voice had started strong, clear, determined, but now, it was hoarse, raw, edged with something too painful to name. Authorities expanded their search radius. Volunteers moved farther, checking creeks, abandoned sheds, drainage ditches, anywhere a child could have wandered, or been taken. Then, at exactly 6 p.m., the call came. We found her. She was discovered near her home. Less than a mile away. Close enough that, at first, it seemed impossible. How had she been missed? How had an entire town combed the streets only for her to be found so near? But it wasn't the proximity that made everyone freeze. It was the condition in which she was found. The first officer on scene would later say the moment was surreal. That the air seemed heavier, thicker, as if the world itself had tensed around the discovery. There were no immediate signs of trauma, the official statement read. No evidence indicating foul play at first glance. No arrests were made. No suspects identified. Just silence. Just uncertainty. Just a mother collapsing at the weight of a reality too brutal to bear. Authorities held a press briefing that night, brief, measured, careful. The words were neutral, but their faces weren't. Beneath the professionalism, there was unease. The kind that comes when something isn't adding up. Within hours, speculation spread like wildfire. Some believed it was an accident. Others were certain it wasn't. She was too close to home, people wrote online. Someone must have put her there. She disappeared in broad daylight. No struggle. No witnesses. How does that happen? The questions built upon themselves, stacking higher and higher, until theories blurred into reality. Had she wandered off? Had someone taken her? And if so, why was she returned? In the absence of answers, speculation was the only thing people had. An autopsy was scheduled for the following morning. Officials hoped it would provide clarity, some form of explanation that could make sense of the senseless. The medical examiner was methodical, precise, experienced. But even the most seasoned professionals can struggle with cases like these. The results would take time. Days. Maybe weeks. And until then, the town sat in limbo, caught between grief and mystery, between sorrow and suspicion. In the days following Gracelyn's discovery, the Vick household was eerily quiet. The kind of silence that lingers even when people are in the room. The kind that wraps around grief, settling in like an unwelcome guest. Emily, once full of warmth and light, hardly spoke. She moved through the house as if in slow motion, her body present, but her mind somewhere else, somewhere where Gracelyn still giggled at the breakfast table, still ran through the halls with her mismatched socks, still curled up with Ollie in the living room. Mark, always the steady one, struggled in his own way. His hands clenched when he spoke. His voice grew quieter, heavier. And when he thought no one was looking, he stared at the door, at the very spot where his daughter had last stood before stepping outside. She had vanished in an instant, and now, their home felt like a shell of what it once was. The town, so full of life and routine before, had changed. People whispered in grocery aisles. Parents held their children closer. Neighbors who had once felt safe left their porch lights on all night. At the local school, teachers spoke softly. They glanced at empty desks, wondering if Gracelyn's classmates understood the weight of what had happened. Some did. Others were still too young to grasp the finality of it. There were memorials. Candlelight vigils. Her name was spoken in hushed tones, followed by head shakes and deep sighs. But beneath the grief, something lingered, uncertainty. A collective unease. Because no one really understood what had happened. The questions still hung in the air, unanswered. The official reports left gaps, too many gaps. There were no obvious signs of harm, but there was no clear explanation either. Did she wander off? Was she taken? If so, why was she returned? Theories twisted themselves into knots, each one clashing with the next. Some believed she had gotten lost, confused, disoriented. Others were certain it wasn't that simple, that someone had taken her and, for reasons unknown, placed her back where she could be found. Authorities combed through evidence. They rechecked locations. They reviewed any security footage they could find. But no clear answers emerged. No suspect was identified. No motive was uncovered. It was the kind of mystery that leaves a town unsettled, that lingers in the backs of people's minds long after the news cycle fades. The case sparked conversations far beyond the town's borders. Experts weighed in. Safety specialists issued reminders. The tragedy served as a grim warning, one that echoed in the hearts of parents everywhere. "It's never just another day," one child safety advocate said. "We always assume our neighborhoods are safe, until something happens." Discussions revolved around ways to prevent disappearances. More vigilance. Community awareness. Stricter precautions. But beyond the safety measures, beyond the policies and public service announcements, one truth remained. Gracelyn should have been safe. And yet, she wasn't. There is a certain weight that lingers in the air after tragedy. It doesn't vanish when the headlines fade, when the search teams pack up, when the memorial candles flicker out. It stays, woven into the fabric of a family, embedded in the silence of a home that was once filled with laughter. For the Vicks, life would never return to what it was before. Their mornings would not start with the sound of small footsteps racing down the hall, their evenings would not end with stories and sleepy whispers under a blanket fort. A part of their world had disappeared. And no explanation, no report, no autopsy, no careful arrangement of official statements, could make sense of it. The town, once familiar and predictable, had changed. Graceland's absence was felt in places big and small, in the empty swings at the playground, in the quiet corners where she once played, in the way people looked over their shoulders just a little more than before. Some continued searching for answers, combing through possibilities, turning over questions like stones, hoping something, anything, would give them clarity. But answers did not come quickly. And perhaps, for some, they would never come at all. Weeks passed. The investigation pressed forward, but the case remained clouded in uncertainty. Some believed it was a tragic accident. Others were certain there was more to the story, something unseen, something unresolved. Authorities followed leads, ruled out possibilities, sought closure in cold facts. But for the Vicks, for those who had known Graceland as more than just a name in a headline, closure was impossible. How does a family heal from something they cannot understand? A family shattered. A community mourning. A case still unfolding. I invite you to share your thoughts, your perspectives, your experiences. What can we learn from this? How can we change the narrative? And if these stories, these slow, immersive explorations into real events, matter to you, I encourage you to subscribe for more. More stories that don't just recount facts, but take you through the moments that shaped them. More voices that question, analyze, reflect. More time to pause. To absorb. To think. The weight of true crime can linger long after a story ends. Some cases haunt us, some leave us unsettled, and some, like this, remind us of the fragility of life. As we come to the end of today's story, take a moment to breathe. To let the tension release. To let the mind settle into the quiet again. The world carries many stories. Some unsettling. Some heartbreaking. Some that leave us searching for answers. But in this moment, there is only stillness. As you settle into rest tonight, let the calm settle over you. Our background sounds will carry you into tranquility as you drift towards sleep. Thank you for being here, and until next time, stay safe and take care.